Senator Ludlam.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I won't say that I'm pleased to stand to support this bill today because of the context in which we're conducting the debate, but I would thank senators from both sides of the chamber for the respectful way in which they've engaged with the measures in the bill. I'll speak briefly to the concerns that have been raised by Senator Conroy and Senator Fawcett earlier, which I think are reasonably easy to categorise, and they've been a part of this debate for years. This bill has been languishing in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. It was introduced by the Australian Democrats in 1985. When I was elected in 2007, I inherited the bill from Senator Andrew Bartlett of the Australian Democrats, and it has been on the notice paper of this place more or less continually for that period of time. As a number of other senators have acknowledged, the most recent committee inquiry into this measure was conducted in 2009 by the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, reported February 2010, and it was treated in quite a cavalier fashion. Although others have acknowledged the value of the work that was conducted, the committee at the time blocked our request to even hold a hearing. And the evaluation of the bill's measures was done on the papers because it wasn't thought that any of the witnesses could add anything substantive to the debate, an opinion of which I strongly disagree to this day. We convened a hearing. We had to let the witnesses and those who gave evidence know that they weren't protected by parliamentary privilege. It was not a formal hearing of the parliament. Nonetheless, people from a very wide variety of backgrounds, very senior levels of defence, intelligence, the Australian Defence Association, groups like the Marrickville Peace Group, the whole spectrum of views on this. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, Senator Brandis? Just hilarious. A whole range of groups with a range of views, from those, former Secretary of Defence and people who've been engaged in these issues at the very highest level, brought a range of opinions to bear that the issues are not insurmountable and that it is, in fact, time for Australia to grow up and to put this power into the hands of the legislature, as so many other countries have done. So I certainly commend to this chamber not just the report of the committee, the majority report, which I think actually set out quite coherently the arguments for and against a measure like this and the ways in which we could have moved the debate forward. And then the major parties simply combined to recommend that nonetheless it not pass. And our minority report of the time still stands the test to this day. When I say it's time to grow up, the power to deploy young men and women into combat, from which they may not return or may return damaged, physically or mentally, remains at the moment effectively with the Crown through the Prime Minister's office, as it has since the days of feudalism and monarchies. And that's what I mean by time that we grew up. It is not enough to be able to say the Prime Minister should be able to decide, as the King did hundreds and hundreds of years ago, to marshal his peasantry and send them into war. And that is why in recent decades we've seen kindred democracies transfer the war power from the authority of the executive, in whatever form it takes in democracies, into the legislature. And in a moment I'll directly address some of the issues that Senator Fawcett raised, and I thank Senator Fawcett for taking the time to raise them in such a thoughtful manner. The United Kingdom, as Senator Fawcett quite rightly points out, has not enshrined that transfer of the war power from the executive to the legislature in legislation, although there is a bill that's live before Westminster. But in effect what has been adopted is a convention whereby such a motion would be put to the parliament before a deployment. Now this was a largely theoretical consequence of the deep inquiries that the British Parliament held into the horrific engagement in Iraq, the horrific, illegal and mistaken engagement in Iraq that they participated in and that Australia participated in. Unlike the United Kingdom, there has never been an inquiry into the political decision to deploy into war, just a couple of attempts to deflect the errors and the blame to our intelligence services, who we now know were warning executive authorities in the UK, the United States and here in Australia that there were no weapons of mass destruction, there hadn't been since the early 1990s in Iraq, and that there was absolutely no connection between the Iraqi authorities of the day and the violent fundamentalists who had brought down the Twin Towers and crashed aircraft into the Pentagon. Nonetheless, the political decision was made, an utterly flawed one, and the inquiries that resulted in the UK trying to get to the bottom of how such a disastrous strategic error could possibly have occurred have led to a convention which was tested recently when Prime Minister Cameron was proposing to deploy British service personnel into Syria, and the Parliament rejected that attempt. So it actually has been tested in a parliamentary context, in the context of a deployment. In Australia, as so often happens with these things, a huge part of the problem is the forgetting of history, even quite recent history. And kindred democracies around the world, including the UK, the US, Denmark, Ireland, Germany, Japan, South Korea, have transferred a measure of this responsibility all the way up to a full vote in both houses of Parliament, which is what we propose, to parliamentarians, so that those who come in here, and I believe in their genuineness, no matter what your political affiliations, if you come in here and say, as many have, that this is the most serious decision that we could commit to as elected representatives, I believe you and I agree. And that's why I think you should then put your name to it, rather than backing slowly out of the room and leaving it to the Prime Minister's office to decide. The countries I just listed had two things in common. They are mature democracies, and they have outgrown that monarchic tradition of just leaving it to the king's prerogative to send his armies into war. I'll briefly touch on the legitimate concerns that Senators Conroy and Fawcett raised about why they believe that this bill shouldn't pass, and I think these arguments actually have long since been settled. Firstly, the disclosure of sensitive information into the public domain, classified information about troop movements or information that the executive possesses because it's in direct communication with intelligence services and army military intelligence and so on. And it's a fundamental red herring. We do not want to come in here and debate troop movements and tactics. This is the political decision to deploy, not the military tactics that flow from that decision. And that's fundamentally important. We're not asking the Minister for Defence or the Prime Minister to come into Parliament and disclose information that would be prejudicial to those troop movements. It's fundamentally disingenuous, I think, to confuse the politics of a deployment from the military decisions that follow. None of us in here are qualified to then make those strategic judgments that flow, and nor should Parliament be involved in that. The decision to deploy is a political one because we don't live in a military dictatorship. And that's the fundamental distinction that I want to draw when Senator Conroy says you can't possibly ask us to table classified intelligence. Of course not. But don't misread the intentions of the bill. And I imagine that Senator Conroy, who's been in this portfolio now for some time, that it's not a deliberate misreading, but I want to make very clear that we're not asking for tactical decisions to be debated in the Parliament, but thoroughly political ones, since very, very few of us would then put a uniform on and follow these young men and women into the war. Secondly, the issue of flexibility and rapid deployment, also I think a red herring, because it's very difficult to think in recent times, Timor being one counterexample, which I'll get to in a moment, where these issues are not seen coming months in advance. Syria has been in a state of disintegration and, I would argue, profound holocaust. More than 3 million people have been displaced, tens of thousands killed, and the genesis of ISIS goes back many, many years. We can see these things coming. Again, the disintegration of Iraq was foreshadowed by analysts and many in the peace movement before the bombing of Baghdad commenced. We can see these things coming, and I don't think it is at all the case that either recalling the Parliament for an emergency session or submitting the decision to respectful debate as we're doing today necessarily has to have any impact at all in the deployment schedules, because it's unusual, going on unprecedented, that the Prime Minister would wake up one morning with a phone call that says you need to throw the ADF into a fight and you don't have time to consult the Parliament. Timor is sometimes used as an example, as a counterfactual. So I would like to quote Paul Barrett in evidence that he gave outside the regular parliamentary framework, as I said before, to the session that we held, the decision to prepare troops for deployment to Timor. And he goes in quite a bit of detail about the state of readiness of Australian forces at the time, Air Force and Army, and the fact that for most, what he says is for most of 1999, between February and September, there was an opportunity to debate the issue in Parliament. There were sensitivities involved because DFAT was understandably concerned about what signal this training and military forces was sending to Indonesia. So it's not necessarily a debate you would have wanted to have in March 1999, but as you can see, when that was evolving, we were in discussions with the Indonesians and the UN about whether our troops would deploy. There was plenty of time to have a debate in Parliament about what we were doing and why, but to actually get the approval of Parliament, not simply to inform the Parliament. That's Paul Barrett. Now, that is not somebody coming from the margins of debate, that's someone who was involved in decision-making on that deployment at the time. Another myth that I think it's important to dispose of now as senators is the idea that you would submit such an important decision to the whims of the crossbench, or as I think one interviewer put it the other day, a tiny minority in the chamber. And that's remarkable because, of course, the way that this parliament operates is that to pass a vote in this place, you need a majority. And I would ask again those who think that putting such a decision to the parliament is risky. If the Prime Minister of the day can't convince more than half of his or her parliament to deploy, then maybe that's instructive, maybe that's important, maybe there's a counter view, maybe there are other opinions. So it's not that a tiny handful of people would then control whether Australia deployed or not. The majority of the parliament should be deciding these things. I think it's entirely likely, therefore, that if the war power had been vested in this chamber and the other place in recent history, we almost certainly would have gone into Afghanistan. We almost certainly would have participated in the first Gulf War as it was authorised by UN Security Council resolution, but we might not have gone into Iraq in 2003, which is why I found Senator Faulkner's contribution before so curious. We might not have gone. We might actually have been one voice of reason in that debate that would have stayed the hand of the US President and the US administration that was so gung-ho to charge in and declare mission accomplished. And that doesn't seem to have worked out very well, does it? And that, I think, is a perfect example of why this is not such a theoretical concern anymore. It's hard to gather people's interest in such a measure outside of potential deployment, but this is the situation that we find ourselves in today. The idea that if it's not broken, we shouldn't fix it, I strongly submit, in my experience, working as an anti-war campaigner before I came into here, trying to stop the deployment into Iraq, as we were getting aircraft carrier movements passing through Fremantle for resupply and R&R before they sailed for the Persian Gulf to fire cruise missiles into a city a very, very long way from here. And in my experience, it is broken and it does need fixing so that that kind of thing can never happen again. If the Australian government refuses to hold an inquiry into how we got into Iraq, then at the very least we can prevent that kind of debacle from ever occurring again. Because it's the politicians, and I've done this, I had a very brief period of time in Afghanistan in the late stages of our large-scale deployment there. The politicians you put on flak vests and helmets, you're taken very, very good care of and asked not to wander off, and then you get to go safely home. And it's not the politicians who actually have to confront the consequences of these deployments by and large. As Senator Milne indicated, simply rushing in again on the coattails of the United States as it attempts to solve horrific violence that's unfolding in the northwest of Iraq with yet more violence, that it is time for a deep breath. Because I think the vast majority of Australians supports humanitarian intervention, and that comes, of course, with a warning that humanitarian intervention into the middle of what is emerging as a civil war requires people to take risks, such as the rumours that I think were later quashed that our airlift into Iraq had been fired upon, that these are risky situations. But then suddenly from there we go to running weapons into a particular side in this fight, and that is where it starts to get extremely messy, in the absence of any kind of UN Security Council resolution, and in the absence, it appeared for a period of time, of proper authorities from the government of Iraq. or it certainly appeared a few important people had been left out of the loop. But the fact is that we are running weapons now into an extremely messy, complex and violent situation where, for example, an organisation, the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party as it's translated into English, that has been listed as a terrorist organisation, largely for attacks within Turkey, but it's been listed here as a terrorist organisation for years and remains on the list. They are right on the front line. They're right in the middle of this fight into which we are now transporting weaponry. And so you go from a humanitarian intervention to running weapons into one side of a complex and violent situation, to support by F-18s, and to then where? To this open-ended commitments that the Abbott government appears to have made to United States authorities without bringing them to this parliament, citing national security and operational security. But what exactly checks have been written in this instance? And what is the plan for peace in that part of the world? Because I think the experience in Afghanistan is extremely instructive. That the United States government, for a period of well over 10 years, armed the Mujahideen. The CIA ran a huge covert operation through Pakistan, arming the Mujahideen because they were fighting communists at the time, and then when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, stepped that up to a massive operation involving numerous countries, arming oppositions to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And then that hardware was turned against the US and Australians decades later, because the Mujahideen then mutates into the Taliban, a horrific administration, nobody would dispute that, that then turned their weaponry on the United States government and Australia when we arrived 2 decades later. Is that what we are opening up now? Because what happens after the press conferences and the media reports of our humanitarian intervention is that people forget and attention moves on, and yet those on the ground have to suffer the consequences of our interventions, one after another, supporting this side, then that. What's the plan for peace? What is the plan for cutting off supplies of funding to ISIS, the Islamic State, from Kuwait, a country that Australians helped liberate not that long ago? Or Saudi Arabia? Has the Prime Minister picked the phone up to the Saudi ambassador to ask what the Saudi authorities are doing to stop huge flows of money, supplies and support to the Islamic State? What have we done to try and stem the tide of people flowing across the Turkish border to join this fight? Have we spoken to Turkish authorities? What have we done in recent times to try and bring about a stable administration in Iraq that doesn't govern for one sect or another in an ancient conflict and ancient enmities? What exactly are we doing to stem this one-way slide towards open armed hostilities a very, very long way from Australia in a catastrophic conflict that we helped ignite? Those are the questions that we have. And is, as some analysts are predicting, is armed intervention or cruise missiles with US flags on them exactly what the Islamic State is trying to provoke? It feeds their narrative of martyrdom. Has that been considered by the Abbott government? These are the questions, I think, that you can have, that you can bring to Parliament in a respectful way, in a democracy, and put on the table and expect to get an intelligent answer before Australians are committed to one side of this conflict or another. I, in my very brief time in Afghanistan, was able to witness firsthand the professionalism of the people that we send into foreign theatres of war, and their dedication and the risks that they take on our behalf. And so the questions today are not for them. Because we don't live in a military dictatorship, they are not the ones who decide when we deploy. We are. It's the civilian government and the politicians who should put their names to resolutions and deployments like this, to whom these questions should be put. Because, as I was able to see firsthand, if we throw the ADF into a fight, they will do their very, very best. And that means the decision is incumbent upon us to not do that unnecessarily, to not expose them to harm unnecessarily, into open-ended conflicts that are very old, that are very complex, and that effectively is the fundamental purpose of this bill. I thank again the senators for the way in which they've engaged with this debate so far.
Thank you, Senator Ludlam. Your time is up. Senator Reynolds.